Hello, this is Dr. Melissa Sutherland, and today we're going to discuss Chapter 1 of Psychological Disorders from McGraw-Hill. First of all, I want you to think about what is abnormal behavior. How is it defined? How do you define it? There's elements such as history, place, tradition, culture, purpose, and gender that are all important variables that need to be considered when determining whether something, a particular behavior or set of behaviors is normal. There's a continuum model for understanding abnormality. What exactly is it? It's a difficult term to define. The author of this textbook explores a variety of criteria to include cultural relativism, deviant distress, and mental illness. There are also 4 behavioral characteristics that psychologists use to determine abnormal behavior, and those 4 Ds are deviant, distressing, meaning it's distressing to the individual, or dysfunctional in terms of interfering with social or occupational functioning, or the last D, which is dangerous, being of danger to self or others. So as we go through this chapter, think about those 4 Ds and how they apply and how you would define abnormal behavior considering cultural context. So psychological disorder is behavior that receives a diagnosis when associated with significant impairment and distress. And that's important. There has to be some type of impairment and distress involved. Psychopathology is the scientific study of psychological disorders, and then we need to look at what is a psychological disorder and what are we simply seeing as individual differences in behavior. So looking at the prevalence of mental illness in the United States, mental illnesses are common in the United States and around the world. It's estimated that more than 1 in 5 U.S. adults live with a mental illness. That's about 59.3 million in 2022, which was 23.1% of the U.S. adult population. Mental illnesses include many different conditions that vary in degree of severity, ranging from mild to moderate to severe. There are 2 broad categories that can be used to describe these conditions. AMI stands for any mental illness, and SMI for serious mental illnesses. That's the 2 categories. AMI encompasses all recognized mental illnesses, whereas SMI is a smaller and more severe subset. So in terms of the prevalence of AMI, in 2022, there was an estimated 59.3 million adults, the same data that we discussed earlier, representing the 23.1% of all in U.S. adults. The observed prevalence was higher among females at 26.4% than males at 19.7%. Young adults aged 18 to 25 had the highest prevalence of AMI. That was about 36.2%, compared to adults 26 to 49 years, which was at 29.4%, and those aged 50 and older at 13.9%. The prevalence of AMI was highest among the adults reporting 2 or more races. That was 35.2%, followed by white adults at 24.6%. The prevalence of AMI was the lowest among Asian adults at 16.8%. So then looking at that smaller subset of more serious mental illness, in 2022, there was an estimated 15.4 million adults aged 18 or older in the United States with SMI, which represented 6% of all U.S. adults. It was higher among females at 7.1% than males at 4.8%. Young adults aged 18 to 25 again had the highest prevalence at 11.6% compared to adults aged 26 to 49 who were at 7.6% and those 50 and older at 3.0%. The prevalence of SMI was highest among adults reporting 2 or more races again at 11.8%, followed by American Indian and Alaska Natives at 7.3%. And it was the lowest among Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders adults at 3.5%. So stop and think what you think might be the reasoning behind the young adults aged 18 to 25 having the highest prevalence of both any mental illness and serious mental illness, and the difference in cultures in terms of their prevalence. What are your thoughts? So the burden of mental illness on health and productivity in the United States and throughout the world has long been underestimated. Data that was developed through a study with the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and Harvard University revealed that mental illness, including suicide, accounts for over 15% of the burden of disease in established market economies such as the US, and that is more than the burden caused by all cancers. Jails and prisons are increasingly becoming warehouses for people with serious mental illness that were formerly hospitalized. People with schizophrenia, severe depression, bipolar disorder, and other serious mental illnesses are more apt to be arrested for minor offenses and spend inordinate amounts of time in jail because they're homeless and cannot make bond. There are now more people with serious mental illness in jails and prisons than in hospitals and mental institutions. So if you think about that in terms of economic issues, your tax dollars are paying for these people to be in jail because they can't afford or don't have insurance to be in a hospital. The challenge in treating institutionalized individuals has been to strike a balance between depriving them of their freedoms and providing them needed treatment. The 1963 Community Mental Health Care Act, often thought of by many to be the impetus for the deinstitutionalization movement, removed the need to deprive patients of their freedom. Countless individuals previously cared for in state institutions were released into communities because when medicated, they were thought to be functional enough to survive in the community. Where do deinstitutionalized individuals go? Recent statistics indicate they have joined the ranks of the homeless. According to Freshwater and Westwood, there are many international differences apparent in the ways reforms are being implemented. However, many of the reforms amplify government interest in mental health. Most of the initiatives lead to deinstitutionalization and the decentralization of responsibility. Some reforms reflect a strong orientation towards supporting and assisting people with mental illness as citizens in the community. I can tell you that I have seen this in action twice in my lifetime. Back in the 80s, early 90s, I was in North Dakota and I worked at a group home where a lot of people who had been in the state hospital were released to group homes to be cared for. So I watched that transition. And then the late 90s, early 2000s, I also watched it occur when I worked at a mental facility in Texas. And we had individuals who had lived for many years, some of them 20 to 30 years at a state hospital in Kerrville, were released to our facility for us to case manage and find them placement in the community. And I can tell you, when you take someone who has lived somewhere for 20 something years and remove them and place them somewhere else, it does not go well. That is what they're used to. That is what they're comfortable with. And you pluck them out of it. And several individuals decompensated and one was lost on the streets. I have not seen a whole lot of good come out of mass deinstitutionalization without providing the support that is needed to these people. Also, Kendra Webdale was a young woman who died in January of 1999. She was pushed in front of a New York City subway train by Andrew Goldstein, who had countless hospitalizations for schizophrenia. He had many documented attempts to get services without success. As a result of that tragedy, New York State enacted legislation that provides assisted outpatient treatment for clients who, in their view, are unlikely to survive safely in the community without additional supervision. These clients may be a potential risk to others' safety. Therefore, this controversial law can force clients with mental illness to take medication. Does this kind of approach work? What are the ramifications of this law? So think about that. Voluntary versus involuntary treatment. Right now in Texas, you have the burden of proving to a judge that a person is of danger to themselves or others for them to be committed to a hospital against their will. We usually operate from the stance of providing the least restrictive care someone needs. So putting that all together, it sounds great to make sure that you're not putting on someone restrictions that are not needed by doing the least restrictive care. But I want you to think about it if it was your child or someone you love who is living on the streets with schizophrenia and they are not taking medications, so they're paranoid, they only get food if people leave food for them. There was a gentleman named Eric who lived in San Antonio over off I-10 and Callahan, where the World Car place is right now, and there's a hospital there on the corner of Medical and the access road of I-10 near Callahan. And there used to be woods in that area, and Eric lived in those woods. He had paranoid schizophrenia. People would leave food on the curb of the parking lot of that hospital, and he would come get it. He was too scared to take it directly from them. He lived there for about 15 years until he died. I can tell you it would be very different for me if that was my child. I don't know that I would be so careful as to want him to have the right not to take medications when he is not in of his right mind to make a decision at that point. And this is not an easy topic. It is something you really need to think about in terms of how much freedom do we give people in terms of making decisions for their mental health, and how much do you not give them that freedom? Because it is a very fine line. Like the gentleman who pushed the woman in front of the subway. Had he received treatment, this may not have happened. Treatment could have been available and he refused it, and it could still happen. Had he been forced to take medication, would that have stopped it? I don't know. So this is something you need to think about as we go through this course in terms of treatment for individuals, and where is that line drawn in terms of whether they receive the treatment voluntarily or involuntarily. So there's also a social impact of psychological disorders. They not only affect the individual, but they affect those around them in their social world, as in what happened to the lady who was pushed in front of the train. There's also a stigma that's associated with psychological disorders, which is a negative label that causes people to be regarded as different, defective, or set apart from mainstream members of society. And a lot of times people won't seek treatment because they are aware of the stigma and don't want to be included in it. So defining a psychological disorder, I want you to think about the following. Do you think any of these behaviors are abnormal? Finding a lucky seat in an exam. Unable to eat, sleep, or study for days after ending a relationship. Breaking into a cold sweat at the thought of being trapped in an elevator. Refusing to eat solid food for days to stay thin. Swearing, throwing pillows, and pounding fists on the wall in the middle of an argument with a roommate. Engaging in a thorough hand washing after coming home from a bike ride. Protesting the rising cost of college by joining a picket line outside the campus administration building. Being convinced that people are constantly being critical of everything you do. Drinking a 6-pack of beer a day in order to be sociable with friends. Or playing video games for hours at a time, avoiding other study and work obligations. Do these behaviors fit what you see as abnormal and might be a psychological disorder? Clinical significance is the criterion for a psychological disorder in which the behavior being evaluated includes a measurable degree of impairment that the clinician can observe. Behavior must reflect a dysfunction in psychological, biological, or developmental process, and must be associated with significant distress or disability in important areas of the person's life. Behavior cannot simply be socially deviant as defined in terms of religion, politics, or other aspects of identity, and it reflects a dysfunction within the individual. So there are several perspectives to look at in terms of causes of psychological disorders. The biological perspective is going to look at biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors that interact together. There are biological contributions such as genetics and changing organ systems that can be looked at. In terms of psychological contributions, the effects of personal experiences and emotional instability are at play, and sociocultural contributions look at circles of influence impacting each other. So looking at them here on this grid, you've got biological looking at genetic inheritance, physiological changes, exposure to toxic substances, psychological elements, past learning experiences, maladaptive thought patterns, difficulties coping with stress, and then sociocultural, social policies, discrimination, and stigma are involved. So in the mid-1400s in Europe, tolerance for bizarre behavior waned. Individuals who acted strangely were said to be in a league with the devil. These individuals were often thought to be witches. According to the authors of a 1486 witch hunting manual, Malleus Maleficarum, or the Witch's Hammer, most witches were women. The primary reasons for this, according to the authors, were that the women were feeble of mind and body and were more carnal than men. The Witch's Hammer was written by 2 Dominican monks and was considered a religious document. Because of the prevailing societal attitudes at the time, it essentially legitimized the mistreatment and murder of women. Definitions of abnormality are in most cases inherently bound to social norms. Since norms vary from culture to culture, one would expect the definitions of abnormality to vary from culture to culture. So considering this followed description from a Western perspective. The seance is opened by singing and drumming. After a time, the shaman falls down very hard on the floor. In a while, the tapping of her fingers and toes is heard on the floor. Slowly she gets up, and already she is thought to look awful like a dog, very scary. She crawls back and forth across the floor, making growling sounds. In this state, she begins to carry out the various rites, such as sucking the illness out of the body and blowing it into the air. Seeing and hearing things that are not there and believing in things that do not exist are signs of disorder in our culture. In some other cultures, they are sometimes considered to be part of insanity, or at other times not. The brief description about the seance is a common ritual practiced by shamanists in a group of Inuit Eskimos in northwestern Alaska. The Inuit note that during the ritual, the shaman is out of mind but not crazy. They contrast the state with Nukhavakak, which is more in line with what Western world considers being crazy. Looking through history at psychological disorders, there were spiritual explanations which regarded psychological disorders as the product of possession of evil or demonic spirits, like we discussed. During that time frame, the treatments include trifling, which was actually cutting holes in the skull to release these evil spirits. There was also exorcism, which were rituals to try to drive out the demons by putting the individual under extreme physical and mental duress. And these treatments were recommended by churches at the time. Later, we moved into the humanitarian era. Psychological disorders were viewed as the result of cruelty, stress, and poor living conditions. They really thought that if you put people into better environments, they would get better. So they developed an approach that was a reaction against that spiritual approach. They didn't feel people should be punished, and they regarded the psychological disorders as a result of the environment and treatment they were receiving. The humanitarian era also looked at moral treatment. They believed that people could develop self-control over their behaviors if they were in a better environment. They also had the mental hygiene movement that focused within psychiatry on helping individuals maintain mental health and prevent the development of psychological disorders. They also had the deinstitutionalization movement, which are the Community Mental Health Act, where they released hundreds of thousands of patients from mental hospitals starting in the 1960s. That developed halfway houses, which were more community treatment facilities designed for deinstitutionalized individuals leaving the hospital who were not ready for independent living. Born out of this also was positive psychology, which emphasizes potential for growth and change throughout life. It views psychological disorders as difficulties that inhibit the individual's ability to achieve highly subjective well-being and feelings of fulfillment. It emphasized health over illness and prevention over intervention. Moving from the humanitarian era into the scientific era, the scientific explanations look for causes that researchers can objectively measure. So going back to Hippocrates, the founder of modern medicine, he believed that there were 4 important bodily humors based on the elements of air, water, fire, and earth that influence physical and mental health, leading to the 4 personality dispositions. Then Claudius Galen developed a system of medical knowledge based on anatomical studies, advancing the position that diseases had their source in irregular bodily function. Scientists made very few significant advances in the understanding of abnormality during this time, which was the 18th century. But then Benjamin Rush, the founder of American psychiatry, rekindled interest in the scientific approach to psychological disorders. He advocated for improvements such as placing patients in their own wards, giving them occupational therapy, and preventing them from basically being put on view for people's entertainment. People would come and visit the hospitals just to see these people, and it was as they were an animal in a circus. There was also the formation of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane, which became later the American Psychiatric Association. So the scientific approach to disorders gained momentum as psychiatrists and psychologists proposed behavior models that included explanations and medically based treatments for abnormality. Sigmund Freud developed the psychodynamic theory. Ivan Pavlov discovered classical conditioning, which became the basis for the behaviorist movement. B.F. Skinner formulated a systematic approach to operant conditioning, and there were newer models that led to the evidence-based ways to understand causes of psychological disorders. So the scientific method is a process of testing ideas about the nature of psychological phenomena without bias before accepting these ideas as adequate explanations. Objectivity is the foundation for the scientific method. It uses a progression of steps posing questions of interest to sharing the result with the scientific community. Researchers must remain as objective as possible when studying psychological disorders and maintain distance when analyzing findings without bias. A meta-analysis is a statistical approach that evaluates significances of findings across multiple studies and samples. Researchers use inclusion criteria to ensure that the findings from previous studies were valid, reliable, and represent samples of the population of interest. They can also provide strong support because they incorporate more than one research group's results. Now, in this course, when you are looking for articles to use for your paper, you will avoid meta-analyses because they are reporting on the research of others, and we want you to use a primary source. In terms of experimental design, you have an independent and a dependent variable. The independent variable is the variable whose level is adjusted or controlled by the experimenter. The dependent variable's value depends on the outcome of the manipulation of the independent variable. So the independent variable gets manipulated and you measure the change that occurs in the dependent variable. There's a randomized control trial, and that is where researchers randomly assign participants to conditions in which they receive different forms of intervention or treatment. The use of randomization minimizes the chances that biases can enter into the decision of which participants receive which treatment. A randomized controlled trial is used as the foundation for evidence-based treatment in which clients receive interventions based on the findings of controlled clinical trials. There's a placebo condition where a participant would receive a treatment. It looks like the same treatment the other group is receiving, that is receiving the actual treatment, but it lacks a key feature. So for instance, if you have two groups in a study and you're studying medication for allergies, one group would actually get the actual medicine. The other group would get a pill that looks like the actual medicine, but it's like a sugar pill or something. That would be a placebo. A placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial is an experimental method in which participants are randomly assigned to a placebo versus a treatment group. A double-blind method is where neither the person giving the treatment nor the person receiving it knows whether that participant is in the control or experimental group. The control group, if you're using a placebo, is the group receiving the placebo. The experimental group is the group that's receiving the real actual medication. A quasi-experimental design is where differences among groups are not created by random assignment. So the groups are created based on some other variable and not randomly assigned. And that may be needed in a study such as individuals have a specific medical issue, or you're doing it maybe separating them by age, but there's some reason that you are putting them in the specific groups. A correlational design tests relationships between variables that the researchers cannot experimentally manipulate. And there is a correlation statistic from -1 to +1 that is indicating the strength of that correlation. Positive correlations indicate that as the score on one variable increases, the score on the second variable increases as well. Whereas a negative correlation is whereas the score on one variable increases, the score on the second variable decreases. So an example of a correlational design would be if you did a study to see if the intake of caffeine was correlated with improved test scores. So you would measure the amount of caffeine intake, and you would measure or have the test scores, and then you would see if there was a correlation. As the amount of caffeine increased, did the test scores improve? That would be a positive correlation. Or as the amount of caffeine increased, did test scores decrease? That would be a negative correlation. So here are some other types of research methods. Surveys, which you're probably very familiar with. Obtain population data. So an example would be researchers working on a government agency attempt to determine disease prevalence through a questionnaire administered through the telephone. A laboratory study is when data is collected under controlled conditions. You're actually in a lab and you're controlling what is going on. An experiment would be conducted to compare like reaction times to neutral and fear-provoking stimuli would be an example. Case study is, that purpose is when you're looking at an individual or a small group of individuals to study them intensively, such as when a therapist describes the cases of members of a family who share the same unusual disorder. A single case experimental design, the purpose would be that the same person serves as subject in an experimental and also in a control condition. So researchers report on the frequency of participants' behavior while they're being given attention, which would be the experimental treatment, versus being ignored, which would be the controlled condition for aggressive outbursts in a psychiatric ward. That would be an example. For behavioral genetics, the purpose would be to attempt to identify genetic patterns and inheritance of particular behaviors. An example would be genetic researchers compare the DNA of people with and without symptoms of particular psychological disorders. When you're using a survey to gather information from a sample of people that should be representative of a particular population, it can be very tedious to consumers, and response burden means that you're balancing information with problems with participants. Also, if you think about it, surveys can be very expensive if you're having to pay for paper surveys to be mailed out, or you have to advertise, or you have people calling people. So that's something to think about as well. Things that surveys are used for is to find the incidence of a disorder, like the frequency of new cases within a particular time, or the prevalence of a disorder, looking at the number of people who have ever had a disorder at a given time or over a specified period. And then also used for comorbidity, which is the co-occurrence of two or more disorders within the same individual. Laboratory studies allow for gathering data while you're controlling for other variables, and can be an appropriate setting for self-report data in which participants respond to questionnaires. So you have them come in to do it, but they're in a controlled environment. Increasingly, online experiments are used to simulate laboratories because of their convenience and ability to expand their samples beyond those who can physically enter the lab. So that's allowed them to expand who they can reach for these studies. Case studies are used to research or to intensively provide clinical interviews, observations, and tests for individuals or small groups. Qualitative research is a method of analyzing data in which researchers use rigorous methods to code the data and summarize information in a way that reflects an objectively applied set of standards. Recent improvements in statistical software for analyzing qualitative data now make it possible to develop reliable coding schemes that other researchers can replicate. So when you think about qualitative versus quantitative is you have a specific number of something that you're working with. Qualitative would be like the results of interview questions. You're interviewing people and they give you answers, or even write-in survey question answers. So you ask someone a question, but it's a write-in. They can write in their answer. So you're taking this information that you're given, it's not quantitative, and then you have to code it to make sense of it. And so when it's talking about this software now is available to where it helps you to code the data and make sense out of it, and to be able to create a picture of what all of this data is, the story that it's telling. There's also single case experimental design, where the same person serves as the subject in both the experiment and control conditions. It is useful for studies of treatment of effectiveness and alternates usually between the baseline condition and the intervention. So looking at where someone was before the treatment and then where they are after the treatment. Another term for single case experimental design is an ABAB design, reflecting the alternation between conditions A and B. And this is an example you have where they're alternating between whether or not someone received treatment and what their scores were for suicidal ideation. So for this person, before treatment, they had higher scores of suicidal ideation. And then during treatment, these were the scores, and you can see how it goes up and down between the two. Genetic research identifies the role of heredity factors in psychological disorders. Also, there's a heritability index, which is a decimal that can range from 0 to 1, that is looking at a measurement of that influence of hereditary factors. Genetic epidemiology is comparing the rates of individuals varying in degree of genetic closeness. Gene mapping is an approach used by biological researchers in which they examine variations in chromosomes and connect them to performance on psychological tests or diagnoses of specific disorders. Molecular genetics is the study of how genes translate hereditary information. I hope this was helpful. Thank you and have a great day.